Good afternoon, everybody. It's absolutely awesome to be here, particularly with so many of my design cabal members, a group of us that have linked up online and have been discussing design in the military institution for a number of years electronically, and just recently we've been able to actually physically meet and share our ideas. I'm going to talk to you today about my own design journey that I've taken at the Canadian Forces College, and you've heard a couple of references to it, very glowing references, and I have to say I'm entirely chagrined to hear these sorts of things because, you know, you get Ben and Aaron coming up and they got these slapdash, presentations, and they got all these great diagrams and that. And for me, working at the college, it's like wandering through a swamp many times, and I'm just hoping to get out of the swamp alive. So thank you for the accolades, but it's been a hard journey, and I'm still not sure where the hell I'm going with it. So I hope that doesn't deter you in your own design journeys. In my own sort of admissions here, I'll just encapsulate that. There's a famous line from Marcel Proust, who's his gentleman, who says he's been speaking in prose all his life and never really been aware of that fact, and in fact that really captures my own realization of myself as a designer in terms of how I've been teaching and structuring courses at the Canadian Forces College, at least in what I would call the modern era, since 2008 when we began to work on the National Security Program. Since 2013, we've been explicitly trying to introduce design into the curriculum of the National Security Program, and we've since introduced it at the majors level with the Joint Command and Staff Program as well. But I realized in doing so and encountering designers who really do this for a living, that I'd actually implicitly, unconsciously been doing it since at least 2008. And so I'm like Marcel Proust's gentleman and prose. And in fact, the presentation here, Stumbling into Design, is really captures what actually took place in terms of how we began to talk about design. It was something that we just stumbled onto and has had a dramatic effect since then. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that design journey, both from the perspective of CFC and myself that we both have been on, and reflect on lessons that we've painfully learned, as well as the opportunities that are presenting themselves in the future. So next slide, please. So just to give you a thumbnail sketch, the NSP emerges out of two previous programs known as the National Security Studies Program and the Advanced Military Studies Program, which were devised about the time that I joined the college in 1998. And the AMSP in particular was a course that was designed for lieutenant colonels and colonels who had been through Staff College prior to the introduction of the operational art. And hadn't received education on those types of ideas and processes, and we were going to bring them up to speed through this AMSP program. Obviously, that was a bow wave of particular people, and we worked our way through that organizationally by the time the mid-2000s had taken place, and we recognized that the program was no longer relevant, and we had to move on to something new. And so the curriculum was given to me as the academic, and Howard Coombs, who we've heard from Aaron here this morning, was my military guidestone in this, and we had a great academic professional relationship in trying to come up what were we going to teach in this course, which was called Modern Comprehensive Operations, which told us absolutely nothing, actually, in fact, about what it is that we wanted to teach about, or that we should be teaching. In other words, what does a colonel or a naval captain need to know for the next part of their career? What do they professionally need to know in order to be successful as they move forward in their career? And more importantly, what was the foundation on which we would begin to build that knowledge? What could we stand on and say, this is true, this is what you need to begin to look around the world, and this is what's different from where you've come, or what have you. Now, if we think about junior officers and the challenges that they have, that going back to Aaron's ideas about the schools of doctrine or so on, the junior officers are really all about the application of tactical techniques, Middle management majors are really about the management of operational planning. And so Howard and I basically said, well, really when you get to the level of colonel and beyond, you're into the realm of generating strategic questions. It's not about how shall we achieve our objective, or when or where or with what shall we achieve our objectives, but questions like, what is the purpose that we seek to achieve? Why should we act in one way and not another? How do we work with others with whom we don't regularly work with? What constitutes success in an environment such as that? And for all of these types of questions, we recognize very quickly that there are no ready answers. In fact, there's no doctrinal solutions to any of these types of questions. And so our approach that we developed was what we called critical operational epistemology. And this was essentially the professional, reflective re-examination of practical action. So we recognize that theory doesn't meet up very well with practice, and there's not a lot of it out there at this level to begin with, and that in order to work your way through answering these types of questions, we're going to have to really think hard about what it is that we do and how we think about questions. Next slide, please. Also on top of that, we recognize that there was a growing complexity of operations, and this I call it the military artifact trajectory, is actually based on the work of Aaron Jackson. I've mislabeled a couple of the things, but that's neither here nor there. We recognize military affairs have always been complex. In fact, Clausewitz's trinity, the idea of a trinity, is in fact an early anticipation of what I would say, an early anticipation of complexity science. His metaphor of a pendulum that is swinging between a number of magnets, the type of thing that you can buy in an airport lounge today or an airport gift store. He's already talking about that. And so unlike a linear pendulum, which is regular, can be described with a simple mathematical equation, the motion of which is very predictable and very understandable, when you try and swing a pendulum between magnets, and the pendulum has a magnet on the end, it does all sorts of really crazy, weird maneuvers, which actually complexity theorists and scientists would call a strange attractor. If he'd had the language today, we wouldn't be talking about centers of gravity as the determinant of operations. We'd actually be talking about strange attractors based on his notion of the Trinity. So Clausewitz had an innate understanding, I would say, of complexity. He just simply did not have the language to express it that we have today. And in effect, what this diagram shows you is the growing interactivity of agency, if you will, as operations become more complex through time. So at the very bottom, tactics, it really should be labeled drill, is Aaron's first school. Operations, which should have been tactics, is his second school. Joint operations, whole of government operations, his four manuals that he talks about. My addition to this whole thing are two other manuals that don't actually exist. Coalition operations, and I'm not talking about NATO doctrine, because NATO doctrine is just an abstraction, a further abstraction of our own national doctrines that make us interoperable in a procedural way. But what I'm talking about in coalition operations are the problems of frenemies, the problems of caveats, the problems of contribution warfare, the problems of coalitions of the willing, the problems of unity of effort rather than unity of command. These sorts of issues that coalitions wrestle with every day in every type of coalition operation, but for which there is no grounded military knowledge or professional knowledge to help professionals work their way through the problems. And then finally, discourses at the very top, the global war on terror, security, pandemics, demographic shifts, migration, all of these types of things, again, which not only require us to work with our friends in order to solve them, but actually require us to work with our enemies as well. Climate change is a great example. You can't address this unless everybody's working together. And of course, everybody working together is the problem. And there, once again, there's no way that you can systematize this knowledge into a manual, which is why they don't exist in the first place. So at the upper end, we see the growing difficulty of grounding knowledge, and yet this is the space that colonels and generals are going to have to work in. So what's an educator to do in this? The language and cultures at this are so diverse, there are no lessons, no guideposts, no maps for determining how to move. And so we have no idea where we should be moving to either. Next slide, please. So going back to critical operational epistemology, we ran with this idea for the first couple of iterations of the course. And it's a really great way of explaining why we have efficient warfare, but expensive, drawn-out, and ineffective war. We can look at these problems, we can discuss them, we can recognize what the problems are. The critique is really good. And what we recognized as instructors was, you know what, our students already get this well. They've lived that life in Afghanistan. They don't need to be taught this. They've experienced it already. Our classes, however, are not helping them deal with that type of environment, helping them manage or cope with that type of environment. And so we were, even though we were addressing what was a necessary issue, we weren't really helping them move forward as professionals. Now, at about this time, hence my issue here, I stumbled upon a couple of articles, one of them written by Ben, in Military Review on design, and actually a blog post by a guy named Roger Martin, who at the time was the dean of the Rotman School of Management, on how militaries were using design. Who knew? And so I began to say, this is an interesting idea. This design stuff really gets at the problem that we're wrestling with as instructors dealing with this cohort or this group of students. And so we began early. The very first step was as setting up a panel in which we invited Alex Ryan and Roger Martin to come in. And so next slide. The funny thing is that when I met Alex, he says, "You're a design insurgent." I'd never heard that term before, and I thought, wow, that's kind of neat. You know, I'm sitting down there, you know, like a guy running through the bushes, and anyways. But it began me thinking about, you know, what was I doing as an instructor? How was I working through this? And I recognized that the problem I was dealing with was trying to define what the environment was, and how do I address that in terms of getting people to work through the problems? Was the environment just about the operational issues, the complexity things that I've already talked about? Was it about the institutional problems that exist within the Canadian military? And we're not just talking about organizational culture like has been raised a couple of times. It's also the fact that we're a small, very capable, but very small military. We do contribution warfare. We don't do theater warfare. Well, when most of the literature out there for addressing these things is written from an American or a British perspective, that really doesn't help you much as a Canadian, because it's written for a bigger army, not the little tiny one that we have. So again, another problem. The problem of students, the type of students that I'm dealing with. Colonels are a very special beast. They're at the edge of greatness. They don't want to make mistakes. They don't want to appear stupid. Getting them to take risks is very difficult. This is a lesson we only learned when we started teaching design to majors, and majors go crazy for the idea. They love it. They say, give us more. Colonels are, you got to prove this to me. You know, there's a lot of pushback. And that's an issue that you have to deal with as an instructor, that your environment is very different at the colonel level than it is at the major level. And then the personal aspect of this environment. I'm part of the system that I'm trying to change. I'm not something separate. I'm inherently involved in it. The thing that I'm studying, I am part of. There's the academic aspect, the theory versus practice. You can teach theory all you want. Very often, it ain't going to work that way. The minute, you know, I always say my design exercises are like science fair experiments. They could blow up in my face at any moment, and frequently do. So there's a theory and practice, and there's the fact that I'm a civilian. I've never been part of the military, and I got a funny story about that, but I won't bore you with it tonight. I don't have the t-shirt, I don't have the ball cap. So how am I regarded as a professional by the people that I'm trying to teach? That's a challenging issue. All of these things come into this whole problem of what it is to try and teach design. How do we define success? I can have varying levels of success at every one of these different aspects. Some greater, some less. Next slide, please. So the journey has been incredibly challenging, and I really love Ben's metaphor of maritime exploration, about trying to find your way. You're Christopher Columbus sailing off into the unknown, and you really don't know what's out there. And cave hic dragonis, which is the Latin phrase that were written on the edge of the map, beware, here be dragons, is very true about design education within the military. Now, when I came to the college in 1998, I was the only academic there. I was the first academic that had been at the college in about 5 years. I was very much the virus invading the body. The antibodies came out. And I recognized that if I were going to achieve anything, I'd have to move very carefully. And I came up with this thing called the Field of Dreams strategy. If you build it, they will come. And so the whole idea was to start small, to get little things, create niches that you could generate quick successes, build prototypes. It was a design approach, and I didn't realize it at the time. What I show here in terms of the course evolution is, in fact, an execution of that. So you're starting off down here on the left, your left-hand side with the AMSC, the MSP. We're teaching operational doctrine. Critical epistemology, 592 is the course number. We begin to introduce panels, the first idea about design. And at that time, we were also had this exercise, which was a strict planning exercise for the colonels. And the colonels, of course, hated that thing. They said, why are we doing OPP? We're never going to do OPP. That's what we have staff for. Why are you making us do this damn OPP again? So we were going to cancel the whole exercise. And I said to the commandant at the time, let's not do that. We're not going to do a problem-solving exercise. Let's do a problem-framing exercise. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. The result of that was the student said, nice idea. We're not really sure if we're doing design. We need more practical education. So we introduced tutorials. That was the science fair experiment that blew up in my face, particularly on NSP 7, in which I had an actual student rebellion. And people said, we're not doing this shit. We're going to do something our own way. That was really, really painful. But as a designer, it was an important lesson-learning opportunity. What went wrong with my prototype? How can I make that prototype work better? And in fact, what came out of that incredibly painful experience was learning about how to improve the course, how to improve the course narrative, how to explain that course better. And we introduced a whole new narrative on complexity and operations or what have you. And this is where we're going with this. And in the meantime, as you can see, the split off there, we began introducing these ideas to the majors. Okay, last slide, last one here. Yep, thank you. So a couple of conclusions about this whole journey that I've been on. First off, the whole issue of endogenizing design. Ben talked about Trojan horses, his whole wrapping heartworm pills in bacon. I just love that. Because that speaks to the issue that I deal with. You know, when you talk about ontology and epistemology, and you have people going like this, or worse, like that, in the audience, you know you got an issue. And maybe that's the way. I tend to think, and a bunch of my fellows says, you got to stop talking these words. They're terrible. I like to think of myself actually as that insurgent, the instructor as an adversary. And in fact, big words are important. They're important concepts to get across because they enable you to think in different ways. They summarize big ideas into a short, pithy statement and enable you to use it in more different circumstances. But getting that into the military mind, as Corbett remarked well over 100 years ago, is incredibly difficult. Theory versus practice. We constantly having the problem of this analytical. What are the parts? Tell me what the parts are to design so I can do the parts. It's an analytical approach. Tell me what the theory is that sits under here so I can understand it better. When in fact, there is really no theory because it comes from many, many different theories and many different practices. How do we teach an unfamiliar practice? Give me the steps. Give me the 5 things I need to take away. When there are, why 5? Why not 10? Why not 3? Why not 1? You know, those sorts of things. When do we learn to do design? We already heard earlier, got to start right at the beginning. Well, hey, that great idea. Tell me how that works out in a decade's time. I'm facing the problem right now of how to teach design to kernels and to majors. So all of these sorts of things are unknowns and we're, in fact, are problems that we're wrestling with. The staff, we don't do design. We don't practice it. The textbooks will tell you, how do you learn how to do design? You do design. But if you don't do design every day because you've got a half a dozen administrative tasks and marking and all that other bump that goes with your day-to-day life, when do you, as a hopeful designer, learn to do design? I mean, Brent Nesbitt in the back there, he's gone down to JSOW, he's taken the course and all that sort of thing. We can put him up, he can teach techniques, but is he doing design? I don't know. I don't know if he's doing design. Maybe he's doing design. Maybe he's got that innate skill or what have you. But I mean, this is a problem for PME schools, which if we want to do this more, how do we teach the teachers? Especially when they don't get a lot of opportunity to do it. Student leaders. I will tell you right off the front that having a bunch of people like Kevin Whale in the classroom who are open-minded and willing and may have had some previous experience with design. If you've got some people with Sam's backgrounds, or you've got some people coming from software engineering or what have you, who may have thought through design approaches, having them as student leaders in the classroom make them enormous allies to bring along the fence sitters and to shoot back at the naysayers. Lastly, the prototypes. This is really about Ben's map analogy. You really are moving into the unknown. You are sailing off. You might go over the edge. There's no way of knowing because you can't see in front of you. And in fact, you're exploring the unknown, and eventually a map will emerge out of that. But don't expect it to pre-exist, that you're going to have to create that map yourself. And in fact, the map that you create is going to be an individual, very personal thing. And so as instructors and designers, that is exactly the sort of muddling through and stumbling into things that has been actually so valuable in my entire career. So thank you very much for your tolerance, and I look forward to questions.